Hey guys, and welcome back to History of Vision Success. So we're going straight back into our topic on social policies, and we're going to start with where Hitler started, the youth. So the starting point for his big experiment into the creation of this Volksgemeinschaft really was the youth. As Hitler stated at a 1935 Nuremberg rally, we must bring up a new type of human, men and girls who are disciplined and healthy to the core. The Nazis used two major institutions in order to achieve this aim. They had the school system and they had the youth groups. And really, Hitler wanted, and he really believed that by changing and manipulating this new generation, that his 1,000-year Reich was going to benefit from this group growing up and being his real generation. Really, he saw the current generation as almost redundant in this grand scheme of his Reich, because they had not been brought up with his ideology, whereas this new generation, they were what was really important to him. So I've got a whole video on youth groups coming, which we can watch afterwards. And right now we're going to focus really on schools and on the curriculum in this video. So even more so than just this element of their youth and their childhood, once they left school, they would obviously join the RAD and the DAF. So those are both organizations for adult men, for workers, which we'll go through in the video on workers. So it's really, really impossible to escape control. Now, the Nazis hoped this would deter the influence and potential hostile influences such as parents and the church. And they really thought, if we can control people through this funnel for basically the entirety of their life, through our Nazi organizations, then we're really going to keep hold of them and can control them in any way we want. Now, within schools, the Nazis established control in two main ways: control over teachers and control over the curriculum. Now, at this time as well, just so you know, the Nazi education minister was a man called Bernhard Rust. Okay, so he is who's in charge. Now, control over teachers. So what did they actually do? Well, under the law for the re-establishment of the professional civil service, which was passed in 1933 and is something we're going to hear a lot of in almost all of our categories, a number of teachers were dismissed on the grounds of political unreliability or because they were Jewish. Exactly the same thing happened with judges and lawyers. Teachers were pressurized into joining the National Socialist Teachers League, the NSLB. However, most were willing to comply with the regime's demands. By 1936, over 30% of teachers had voluntarily joined the Nazi Party. By 1937, 97% had done so. Members of the NSLB, so that's that organization I just told you about, had to attend a 1-month training course which stressed Nazi ideology and the importance of physical education. By 1938, 2/3 of all teachers had attended. Now, historian Johann Fest actually claimed that the teaching profession was one of the most politically reliable sections of the population. So that idea that actually, teachers were very willing, it seems, to go along with these Nazi ideas. Now, from 1935, central directives were issued by the Ministry of Education covering what could be taught. And by 1938, these rules covered every school year and most subjects. Furthermore, and almost most importantly, if you did not conform to National Socialism, you could just be dismissed. So that same thing we've seen before, your career, your life, your livelihood is all dependent on following the rhetoric, following the message. The curriculum, so the other kind of fork of the control. So we had political indoctrination permeated every area of the school curriculum. We had the vetting of textbooks was undertaken by local Nazi committees after 1933, and from 1935, all textbooks had to be approved. The Nazis' aim to promote racial health led to an increasing emphasis on physical education. They were doing up to 2 hours a day from 1936. Some of you might love that, some of you might hate that. And military drills were becoming a regular feature of PE lessons. So very similar to what we're going to see when we look at youth groups, but this idea of physical education is being militarized. We're involving military drills, we're involving military discipline into this idea of physical education. All of our different lessons kind of have different focuses. So in German lessons, they were used to instill a consciousness of being German through the study of Nordic sagas and other traditional stories. Biology was used to stress race and health and heritage and things like that. There was a strong emphasis on evolution and survival of the fittest. Geography is used to develop the idea of Lebensraum, blood and soil, racial superiority, the idea of justifying why we need to invade certain places, and thinking about the idea of Lebensraum and we need living space, and really kind of indoctrinating these youngsters into why all these things were happening, and to see the benefit, to see the glory of it, rather than to see the problems behind it. At the same time as this is happening, religious education was slowly being replaced and taken away. And by 1939, all denominational schools had been abolished. There was also a move away from coeducation to ensure that different sexes received the appropriate education. Girls were given needlework, music, home crafts, anything that would make them be good homemakers and mothers. And as with other areas of life, the Nazis did not create a new school structure. They used the one they had inherited and supplemented it with new ideas and Nazi institutions. Now, one of these new Nazi institutions was some new schools. So first of all, we had the creation of some different types of boarding schools, particularly for boys, where the idea was they would be training the new elite. One of these was NAPLA, which stood for National Political Institutes of Education. These were schools for boys aged between 10 and 18, with an emphasis on physical education, political indoctrination, military drills. In 1936, these were taken over by the SS, and we had 21 of these schools in 1938 and 39 by 1943. So I guess that shows they were successful, they were popular. These were a military-style boarding school with a real emphasis on militarism. For example, classes were called platoons. Now, we had another school, which actually was kind of a competitive school to the NAPLA schools, and these were called Adolf Hitler schools. These were for boys between 12 to 18, and they were set up by the youth leader, Shirash, and the DAF leader, Lay. So we're going to get to him when we look at workers. Now, they set these up as a rival to the SS's NAPLA schools. They wanted to avoid Rust's interference. Now, only 11 of these were ever created. They were free boarding schools, and they selected pupils based on physical appearance and leadership potential. We also had the castles of order. Now, these were for young men in the 25 to 30 age group, and there were 3 of them in total. They were modeled on medieval chivalric orders, and they were housed in these vast castles, and there were around 1,000 pupils in total who attended these schools. So these are really kind of, training grounds for military leaders and for SS leaders and for leaders in the Nazi Party. After that, we obviously have universities. So, due to the emphasis on physical education and political indoctrination, the Nazis had downgraded the importance of academic education. There were fewer changes in the nature of higher education, and it was more significant the fact that they were being contracted in numbers, the numbers attending were being heavily reduced. So the number of pupils attending university decreased between 1933 and 1939. In 1933, we had 113,000, and by 1939 we had just 57,000. So kind of roughly about half it decreased by about 50%. Now, access to higher education is strictly rationed, and selection is made on the basis of political reliabilities. That same phrase we've heard again, the idea that being National Socialist, agreeing with the policies, going along with things, is what's going to help you progress and access things in life you might want to do. Women are restricted to 10% of places, and Jews are restricted to 1.5% of places. Now, the coordination of universities followed the same patterns as schools. We had the law for the re-establishment of a professional civil service, which meant around 1,200 university professors are dismissed. This is around 15% of the whole. So, a more considerable chunk of university professors are removed. By November 1933, all university teachers are made to sign a declaration in support of Hitler and the National Socialist state. Students had to join the German Students' League, the DS, although around 25% managed to actually avoid this. And furthermore, students are forced to do 4 months labour service and 2 months in an SA camp in order to continue with their studies. So quite a considerable amount of control exercised over the universities. Now, how successful were universities really controlled? So the Nazis experienced very little resistance to their policies in bringing universities under their control. Very few reacted to the purge on university leaders, for example. Many of the faculties kind of self-coordinated themselves, which made it easier for the Nazis. And even under the Weimar period, universities had been dominated by nationalist and anti-democratic attitudes. Student fraternities were a breeding ground for reactionary politics, political viewpoints that, oppose social change and support a return to a previous state of society. So the Nazis were able to really tap into this. This was a place where people wanted to go back to more traditional nationalistic ideas, and the Nazis were able to kind of grab onto that and use that to help them win over this base of support. There's also a pre-existing culture of extreme nationalism, which they could infuse with Nazi ideology. So like what we said when we looked at the idea of propaganda versus terror in the terror state, we have the idea of where ideas already exist, the Nazis are actually quite successful in tapping into those and bringing portions of the population under their control. Student prospects of employment after graduating depended hugely on showing outward support for the regime, much like we've said before. And by 1940, the Nazis realized the adverse effects of their education policy and wanted to actually reverse its anti-intellectual stress in order to compete with other countries, especially in science. So what we see is once the war kind of begins, the Nazis realize they're actually going to get behind, and they're starting to get behind in kind of development, and particularly in scientific developments. So they start to re-emphasize the idea of higher education and universities. And we'll also see when we look at women, the fact that women are re-encouraged to go back to university at this point. So that's really how the Nazis controlled the school system. And, you can see it's quite all-encompassing, to be honest. And I would say it's quite successful in what they do, because they manage to completely and utterly control and tap into most of these avenues quite successfully. Now, you can also understand and imagine if you are teaching things at school, it's probably the best way you can change and manipulate an entire generation's viewpoint, to be honest. Huge amounts of propaganda was used in schools, huge amounts of anti-Semitic propaganda. Math textbook problems would be about, how to kill more people that were seen as undesirable. Young children were absolutely thrown in their face all these ideas of the Nazi state in school lessons. And I think the fact that they managed to get schools so under their control is hugely significant for the Nazi success in kind of cultivating this society of the Volksgemeinschaft.